Good day. Today is Saturday, 18th January 2025. We are 2 days away from the inauguration of President-elect Trump and the start of Donald Trump's second term as President of the United States. And as one conflict, the one in the Middle East, goes into certain remission with the ratification by the Israeli cabinet or Israeli war cabinet of the ceasefire agreement in Gaza, the other global conflict, the other key conflict that is shaping our modern world, the conflict in Ukraine, grinds on. Now, I'm going to start first this program by discussing military-related developments in connection with the war in Ukraine. And I will begin by returning to the topic of the Oreshnik missile system. Now, I have received further information about this system over the last couple of hours, and I should say this information basically is sourced from Russia, but I'm not going to say more. And it is connected essentially to the production and intended use of this system over the course of this year. Now, it seems the production is about to commence on a large scale. There's going to be a significant volume of these missiles produced over the course of this year. And I have been given some indication of where the facility, the production factory, which will produce these missiles, is located. And from what I understand, by the way, this is going to be, or rather this is, because apparently it has already been built, it is in effect a new factory. I've not been given the production numbers, but I understand that they're going to be substantial. And I understand that the plans most emphatically are to use the Oreshnik on a large scale in the conflict in Ukraine, assuming this conflict continues from the second half of this year. The second half of this year, when a sufficiently large stockpile of these weapons has been produced. And, well, Vladimir Putin, in various comments in which he's discussed the Oreshnik, has mentioned the fact that this missile is mostly intended to be used for group strikes. In other words, several missiles launched at a single target, all these missiles launching their 36 warheads at the target. You get a massive saturation strike with warheads made up of this new explosive mixture of tungsten and aluminium. So we are looking at a potentially devastating use of this weapon, possibly on a large scale from the second half of this year, assuming, of course, that the conflict in Ukraine is still ongoing. And I've been informed that alongside the Oreshnik, there is another system, long-range missile system, also coming into production. It is different from the Oreshnik. It's not the same system. It might share some component parts with it, but I haven't been told that, and that's just a possible guess. But it has a different approach and a different kind of warhead, in the sense that the Oreshnik warheads are intended to penetrate fortified positions, bunkers, factory buildings, industrial buildings, do that kind of thing. They're intended to penetrate through them and then explode once the ground surface has been reached, explode in this way using this new explosive that I've discussed in previous programs. Whereas the other system, which perhaps could be used in conjunction with the Oreshnik in strikes, is apparently going to have a completely different kind of warhead, perhaps some kind of fuel-air explosive or more likely thermobaric warhead. The idea is that it's going to be like a kind of gigantic toss system. These terrifying multiple launch rocket systems which launch these sort of big flamethrower projectiles. I use my own language. I accept this is probably completely wrong. But anyway, people, I hope, understand what I mean. These absolutely terrifying systems that the Russians have been using on a very regular basis now in the conflict in Ukraine. Now, this will do the same thing, and one can imagine a situation where there's multiple strikes using the Oreshnik missile on a structure, concentration of buildings, fortified position, or perhaps concentration of troops. The Oreshnik strike first, pulverizing, presumably, all the defensive structures, all the fortifications, and then the next strike uses this alternative system, which essentially is intended, targets the personnel on the site and causes unimaginable destruction to that personnel when it's used against them. So it's highly likely, and I have considerable confidence in this information, that from mid-year we're going to see an intensification in the war, the way the Russians conduct the war, using weapon systems that are new and different, though still conventional, in ways that, well, we've never seen in any conflict anywhere in the world up to now. And to remind ourselves again, the Oreshnik is effectively immune to interception by any air defense system. I presume this other system is immune to interception as well. Again, I've not been provided any great details about it. But anyway, one way or the other, we could be seeing an upgrading in the missile war starting from mid-year, such as we have never seen up to this point. That's the first thing I wanted to say. The second is that over the last 24 hours, we have had significant and important news from the battlefronts. And perhaps the most dramatic claim has been made by the Ukrainian deputy, the deputy of the Ukrainian parliament, Maria Bezuglaya. She obviously is something of a political dissident within the political system in Ukraine. She's become outspokenly critical of the Ukrainian High Command. She has avoided making direct criticisms so far of President Zelensky, at least to the extent that I'm aware. But she has often said things about the state of the war, the state of the military situation, which have turned out to be true, and she's provided a really stark and picture of an increasingly catastrophic situation on the Ukrainian front lines. Now, I regard Bezuglaya as a relatively reliable commentator and reporter of events. But I would say that, firstly, she obviously does not have a military background. So she's not obviously someone who should be looked to for detailed explanations of what is happening on the Ukrainian battlefields. But also, she and certainly not for analysis of the state of the war, of the military movements and that kind of thing. And also, I mean, though she clearly does get quite a lot of information from all kinds of sources, I've never gone to her for detailed explanations of any specific military movement or event on the battlefields. She is extremely good at providing us with an overview of the state of the Ukrainian armed forces and of the condition of the war. But she's perhaps not the go-to person for information about a specific event. But she has now provided us with some information about a specific event. And it has created something of a stir because she has claimed that the Russian army has entered Pokrovsk itself, that the Russians have sent a force into Pokrovsk. Now, there has been no other source that has confirmed this. There have been no pictures or photographs or films that confirm this. I've seen no other confirmation of anything about this from any other channel, bar one. And inevitably, many people are wondering whether Bezuglaya is right. Now, the one place which did appear to corroborate to some extent what Bezuglaya is saying was, from recollection, Slavyangrad, which is, as I've discussed many times, a Telegram channel which is straightforwardly pro-Russian in its approach to the war, but which makes its biases absolutely open and clear, and which I have consistently found to be both reliable in its descriptions of what is happening on the battlefronts, and which I also find as a good place for analysis and a good site aggregator, just say. But it's perhaps important to say that Slavyangrad, though they're appearing to confirm what Bezuglaya has said, at least this is what I understand, they qualify it a little. My impression, and I think this may very well be true, is that what has probably happened is that a Russian reconnaissance group, what is called in this war by both sides a sabotage and reconnaissance group, a small number of men, 5 or 6 or something like that, entered some part of Pokrovsk, perhaps occupied briefly a few buildings there, and then withdrew back to the main body of the Russian forces to the south. And I think that has probably did happen, and I'm going to make a guess that it perhaps happens fairly often, and that we don't often hear it reported, because in overall military terms, in the context of the battle for Pokrovsk, these individual actions by small groups of soldiers conducting reconnaissance of each other's positions really don't in themselves tell us who is in control of any particular location. However, the fact is that it is indeed likely, and I think this is probably true, that the Russians are now sniffing at the actual defences of Pokrovsk itself. They are close, in other words, to finding out what is happening in Pokrovsk and what the state of the Ukrainian defences around Pokrovsk are. And as I've discussed in recent programs, there are Russian drones now operating regularly over Pokrovsk, and Russian fiber optic drones are also operating regularly above the main roads into Pokrovsk, leading into Pokrovsk from the north and the west, the two remaining big roads which are still not under Russian control. On the question of these drones, which are fiber optic drones, by the way, I have to say I should acknowledge a correction I have just received from someone who has some knowledge of these drones, and this person has informed me that these drones have 15 kilometers of cable, even though the cable apparently is incredibly strong and light, weighing perhaps a kilogram, which seems astonishing. But anyway, whatever. Maybe I'm getting these figures wrong. But the point is that these drones apparently do have significant range, and that some of them at least have analogous range to the FPV drones that are the ordinary radio-controlled FPV drones that are used by both sides in the war. But anyway, the Russians are sniffing the fortifications of Pokrovsk. I think Bezeglaya about that is perhaps right, even if she has possibly over-interpreted what is happening. In the meantime, however, the situation for the Ukrainians in the Pokrovsk area continues to get catastrophic. It now seems as if the Russians are in control of most, though perhaps as yet not all, of the village of Kotlino to the southwest of Pokrovsk. And they are also apparently now starting to encroach on the other village of Oreshnik, which is also to the southwest of Pokrovsk, south of Kotlino. These two villages lie on the main road, one of the two main roads leading westwards to Dnipro, the major supply base, and these two roads also lie just south of another road leading also westwards, which it's likely that the Russians already control with their drones and their artillery. So increasingly, it is clear that Pokrovsk is being outflanked, and if you want to go to the various mapping projects, you can see that every day now the Russians gain more territory around Pokrovsk. They capture more villages, they establish more places that they control west of Pokrovsk, and also, by the way, east of Pokrovsk, where of course they've recently captured the two villages of Vozhizhenka and Yelizavetivka, where they have cut the road from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka, and where they're strengthening their positions continuously, and where, as I discussed in a recent program, they may have advanced north of the road. Now, if you want a discussion by a military expert, a real military expert, a military officer, of the importance of Pokrovsk, I would suggest that you go to the various articles that Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis of the US military has been writing on 1945, which is one of the American military magazines. There, Lieutenant Colonel Davis has explained the importance of Pokrovsk, the fact that it is, if you like, at the center of a whole web of roads and railway lines which knit together the various defensive positions that the Ukrainians have right across the battlefronts. And he has pointed out that Ukrainians themselves have spoken about how the fall of Pokrovsk, when it takes place, could result in the entire Ukrainian front line right across Donbass starting to crumble. And we're probably very close to that point already. So this is a critical battle, and the Ukrainians are losing it. And they're also losing another battle, which is perhaps of only slightly lesser importance, which is the Battle of Velikaya Novosilka. Now, yesterday we got reports that the settlement of Vremivka, which lies immediately to the southwest of Velikaya Novosilka, had been captured by the Russians. We now have film of Russian soldiers raising the Russian flag in this village, putting their control of Vremivka beyond doubt, just saying. And there are reports that Russian forces have broken into Velikaya Novosilka itself. They've crossed a small river that separates Vremivka from the remainder of Velikaya Novosilka, the Mokry Yali River, to give it its name. That they're now fighting going on inside the center of Velikaya Novosilka, and that even as the Russians push into Velikaya Novosilka across this small river from the west, they've also begun to push into Velikaya Novosilka from the north. There are also reports that Ukrainian resistance in Velikaya Novosilka is collapsing, and that the Ukrainian troops who are there, who are in effect cut off from resupply, are now doing that which arguably they should have done some time ago, which is that they are leaving, that there is a flight from Velikaya Novosilka underway, and that this small town, about the same size as Suja in Kursk region, incidentally, that this small but heavily fortified town, a important linchpin of the Ukrainian defences in southwest Donbass, that this small town is about to fall completely under Russian control. And it could be that by the time this program is published, this has already happened. Just saying. Now, there's also other reports from other places, from Toretsk. I've discussed Toretsk many times. It does seem as if the Russians control the entire metropolitan area of Toretsk. But there are reports now that the last residential area in Toretsk, just to the east of the coal mine, where there are still Ukrainian troops located, that this last residential area, a suburb called Krimsky, has now been captured by the Russians, and that Russian troops are now clearing the coal mine itself of the remaining Ukrainian troops there, in which case the whole of Toretsk, every single part of Toretsk, will have fallen completely under Russian control. And lastly, there are further reports that the Russians are now breaking into the last remaining Ukrainian positions in central Chasiv Yar. This is the area of the high-rise buildings immediately adjoining the industrial area, which the Russians have captured. And there are suggestions that Chasiv Yar also, which is connected to Toretsk, is likely to fall as well. And that the Russians have enlarged their bridgehead across the Zherebets River and are now coming within artillery distance of Liman, the town which the Ukrainians were able to recapture at the high point of their Kharkiv counteroffensive in the autumn of 2022. So we are looking at a further crumbling of the Ukrainian front lines. And all of this is happening with reports. I read a very interesting report about all of this in Redovka, a Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, very much supportive of the war, but very well informed about the situation on the battlefronts. And Redovka claimed that the Ukrainian command is now desperately short of reserves. To the extent that it has any left, it continues to reinforce them, to send them, to hold positions in two places, Kursk region, where the Russian Defense Ministry claimed that 64% of Kursk region, the area in Kursk region which the Ukrainians had captured, that this 64% has now been recaptured by the Russians. Anyway, Ukrainian troops continue to be sent to Kursk region to try to hold positions there, but that the Ukrainians are also, the Ukrainian command is also rushing whatever troops it still has over and above those it sends to Kursk region, to the Pokrovsk area, but that the troops it sends are insufficiently trained and poorly equipped, and that they suffer from desertions and command problems, and that they have not been able to hold back the Russian advance in Pokrovsk. And according to Redovka, once these reserves, the ones that are sent to Kursk region and the ones that are deployed in Pokrovsk, are burnt up, well, it would be an exaggeration to say that the Ukrainians will have nothing left, but their forces are going to be significantly weakened. Now, anybody who follows the war closely is aware of the excellence, as I've said many times, of the reporting on both sides. But amongst the Russian reporters, I would say that the star is Marat Khairulin, who I think is one of the finest war reporters around, at least, amongst the Russian and Ukrainian forces. And he has described the situation in the war. He has said on his Telegram channel that the Russians have won the war, that there is now no way in which this outcome can be reversed. He says also that the Russian forces are growing in strength consistently. He has provided some very interesting information about their makeup. He says that because of the large number of volunteers that the Russian army has been receiving, many of whom are young men in their 20s, not 18 to 25-year-olds, but adults, but young adults in their 20s. The Russian army has gradually got younger, that these younger men go through a 4 years training, that they are being trained by veterans of the war, and that there is a policy gradually within the Russian military to replace the older men in their 40s with these younger men, and also to replace older officers with younger officers who have also received training from the older officers. In other words, there's a gradual rejuvenation of the military, even as it becomes more experienced and more capable of conducting operations. And the mood, supposedly, is becoming increasingly confident. And Khairulin has also described how the fighting basically is now conducted, that there is less and less hand-to-hand fighting. Sometimes it does occur, but there are fewer firefights than there were, because the Russian advantage in firepower has now become so overwhelming that when the Russians approach a fortified position, they can outflank it, and they can bomb and shell it until resistance within it essentially collapses. So he contrasts that with the state of the Ukrainian army, which is becoming older and more tired, and where training is poor, and where much of the more experienced and capable junior officer NCO contingent has been eliminated. I mean, they've been killed or wounded, or other things have happened to them over the course of the war. So he describes a younger, fitter, stronger army on the Russian side, an older, weaker, more exhausted army on the Ukrainian side, one which is unable to fill the gaps and keep up the fight in the way that it was, and one which is unable to close holes in the front lines with capable and properly formed reserves. And one sees that very vividly now in the fighting in southwest Donbass, in and around Pokrovsk. Now, going back to what I said about the Oreshnik, Medvedev, who is the head of the Russian Military Industrial Commission, which has a general overview of the military situation, of the situation with weapons procurement. He's not directly in charge of weapons procurement, but he sort of keeps an eye on it and supervises it. Anyway, Medvedev has chaired a meeting of the Military Industrial Commission, and he has said that military industrial production increased significantly in 2024, and he said that it is going to increase even further in 2025. He's quoted as saying, "Our basic task for this year is to keep the pace gained last year. The schedule of producing especially needed armaments in 2025 has been approved, and with regard to a considerable number of items, this output has increased. Developing high-tech weapons is a top priority. Naturally, this relates to the entire spectrum, including drones that have shown high efficiency on the battlefield." And we're told that there's been considerable retooling and production improvement of the factories, so the Russians are expecting a further increase in military production this year, at a time when factories in Europe and in the United States are barely getting started in this. Now, notice that Medvedev specifically refers to especially needed armaments. And I wonder whether that is a reference to the Oreshnik and to the accompanying missile, the one with, I'm going to call it the thermobaric warhead, whether that might be what Medvedev is alluding to here, without wanting to say too much. That, of course, is purely a guess. I might be wrong, but who knows. Anyway, the point is that Ukraine is being comprehensively outmatched. The war is being lost on the battlefield. Daniel Davis, again, if I can go back to him, in the various articles he's written at 1945, where he has a regular column, has made this point for several months now, as, by the way, I have done. I'm not the only person to do so. Colonel Douglas Macgregor, has been saying the same thing. Others have said this as well. And if we pivot back to this question of the negotiations, which I've discussed many times, the negotiations which Donald Trump wants to undertake, the key thing, and I've said this already, for Trump and for his people to understand, is that the war in Ukraine is already lost. The Russians have won. The question now is, how far west do the Russians choose to go? It's no longer whether they can be prevented from advancing further westwards. It's whether they choose to stop at any particular place. And here perhaps it's worth emphasizing a point which in one of these articles Daniel Davis has also made, that this idea that because there is still 80% of Ukraine still under Kiev's control, that means that Ukraine can go on fighting for years and years and years and can sustain resistance in the same sort of way that it is doing at the present time. That this view has no basis in military reality, with most of the Ukrainian army stuck in eastern Ukraine, east of the Dnieper, with the recruitment situation in Ukraine absolutely disastrous, with the Ukrainian economy shot to pieces. Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, has now come forward and has actually made certain comments about the fact that already, as of now, Hungary as a state, essentially, to all intents and purposes, Ukraine, as a state, to all intents and purposes, does not exist. Its economy functions purely as a product of Western aid. It has no capacity for internal growth. It is entirely, as I said, dependent on assistance from the Western powers. And a state like this, a country like this, with an army that is gradually, which is in deepening crisis, once this process of the Russian advance continues, the prospects of an acceleration, which in fact we have been seeing already throughout the summer and autumn of 2024, the prospects of a further acceleration grow ever greater. Daniel Davis actually speaks about an even more Russian breakthroughs and Russian advances at a speed and a pace that we have not seen before, perhaps starting to happen sometime soon, and for which the West appears to be completely unprepared. Anyway, I mention all of this because even as the war continues, even as the Russians move ever closer to closing in on their success, we continue to live, or at least many of us do in the West, in a state of absolute denial about it. Now, yesterday, I discussed the agreement, the partnership agreement, that Starmer and Zelensky signed off whilst over the course of Starmer's brief visit to Kiev, which Starmer and Zelensky signed off over the course of Keir Starmer's brief visit to Kiev. Now, yesterday, when I discussed this document, I had not actually read it, but it has now been published on the British government's website. And I have to say, it proved every bit as surreal as I expected that it would be. First of all, can I say that it is extremely short? Secondly, it contains provisions which, as far as I can see, have virtually nothing of relevance to Ukraine's existing critical situation. There is, for example, a paragraph in this document, which I should make clear, by the way, is not a treaty. In fact, I'm not even sure what exactly the nature of this document is. It looks more like some kind of statement of intent or memorandum of agreement between two governments, or it's declaratory, but it is not yet a treaty, and I don't think it's intended to be seen as a treaty in any way. But anyway, it contains paragraphs like this, that the parties, that's to say Ukraine and Britain, agree on prioritizing women, girls, persons with disability, and marginalized groups at the heart of all they do, and recognizing the potential for their citizens to move between their respective nations, forging more ties and countless partnership opportunities. That is actually a paragraph written in this agreement. Notice, by the way, that amongst other things, it appears to open the door to more immigration into Britain from Ukraine, just saying. But anyway, it's all there. It's set out. Again, how this bears on the realities of Ukraine's situation at this particular point in time, I'm completely unable to see. Moreover, though the document talks about a 100-year agreement, elsewhere in the document, we are told that the agreement may be cancelled at any time by either party on giving 6 months' notice to the other. So it's a 100-year agreement, but one which can be terminated by either party by sending a written notice to the other party. The agreement shall be terminated 6 months upon the date of receipt of such notice. So it's perhaps not quite as binding over 100 years as it appears to be. Anyway, just to say, but there it is. Now, most of it is extremely vague, and it doesn't seem to me to contain any significant provisions of particular importance at all. But it does contain some provisions like this: that the parties reaffirm their support for Ukraine's European and Euro-Atlantic aspirations, with NATO membership being the best guarantee of its security, and the UK being dedicated to supporting Ukraine's irreversible path to NATO membership. So Britain is committing itself to the NATO membership of Ukraine. Again, that is, if nothing else, incredibly provocative at this time. It fails to recognize entirely the fact that the Russians have not only ruled that out, but have made absolutely clear that unless this is ruled out, and ruled out in categorical terms, then the war will go on, and more and more of Ukraine will be destroyed. So in that respect, it is a denial of reality. But it is also, if I may say so, a slap in the face of no less a person than Donald Trump, who had just made statements that straightforwardly contradict that. Donald Trump, who in 2 days' time is going to be President of the United States, the most powerful man in the West, if not the world, the man who, to a great extent, holds the future of the West in his hands, he has already said that he understands that the war, that the proximate cause of the war, is the West ignoring Russian objections to Ukraine's NATO membership, and that he understands why the Russians would object to Ukraine entering NATO. So here we have Starmer signing off on something that the Russians are going to see as massively provocative, and which the President of the United States is already publicly taking issue with. And elsewhere, we read in the document some of the provisions that the document actually commits Britain to doing. So Article 1 talks about Britain doing everything it can to help Ukraine's military position helping Ukraine to build up its own defense industries. Article 2 speaks of strengthening security and building consensus on Ukraine's NATO membership. The parties shall build on areas that benefit Euro-Atlantic peace and stability well beyond the war, recognizing Ukraine's integral role in Euro-Atlantic security with a focus on Ukraine's interoperability and contribution as a future NATO ally. It then, Article 3 takes even more extreme positions, being a partnership in the field of maritime security. The parties shall endeavour to address long-term systemic threats and challenges to maritime security in order to restore freedom of navigation. The parties shall establish a maritime security partnership, including with the objective of strengthening of Baltic Sea, Black Sea and Azov Sea security. And the implication appears to be that Britain is going to establish bases in Ukraine's Black Sea coast, including in the Sea of Azov, which of course is currently entirely controlled by Russia. Again, incredibly provocative, and a proposal which in effect can only become effective following the total defeat of Russia. Now, there is another point here, because of course it talks about strengthening of Baltic Sea, Black Sea and Azov Sea security. But Ukraine is not a Baltic power. It has no shoreline on the Baltic Sea. What exactly is this intended to mean? There have been a series of statements coming out of Belarus about how the Belarusians are worried about a potential Ukrainian attack upon them. And there's even been statements by Lukashenko that Belarus is preparing for this attack and will rely on the tactical nuclear weapons and the Oreshnik missiles that Russia has already deployed or is going to deploy in Belarus to protect Belarus from this potential attack by Ukraine. Is this provision in Article 3 made in anticipation of that Ukrainian attack and in the expectation that it will be successful? Does it presume that Ukraine is going to conquer and annex Belarus? I mean, I ask the question. That would not give Ukraine a Baltic shoreline, but it would bring Ukraine into contact with friendly powers that do have Baltic coastlines, notably the 3 Baltic states. Anyway, this is an astonishingly provocative document. It is, as far as the Russians are concerned, it is, again, a document that is going to feed Ukrainian expectations of unlimited British support, even perhaps support for a possible Ukrainian advance into Belarus. This at a time when Ukraine is currently losing the war against Russia. And of course, as I've just said, it contradicts statements about policy made by the man who in 2 days' time is going to be the President of the United States. What are the British thinking? Now, the Russians have responded to this, and this was said by the Russian embassy in London. And I have to say, in parenthesis, when I read a document like this, when I read Britain signing off on an agreement of this kind, an agreement which, as I said, has no practical value, but which does have a symbolic one. It's going to infuriate the Russians, annoy Donald Trump if he learns about it, which at some point he will, by the way, and encourage the Ukrainians in ways that Britain cannot itself fulfill, give the Ukrainians expectations that Britain cannot meet. Anyway, I wonder how long the Russians, reading documents like this, will say to themselves, well, is there any point in us maintaining any kind of relations with Britain at all? I have to say, when I read these sort of documents, I wonder whether before long we're going to see a complete rupture, even in diplomatic relations between London and Moscow. Whether we're even going to have embassies in each other's capitals anymore, given how markedly unfriendly towards Russia. In fact, I correct that, markedly hostile towards Russia this document is. But anyway, this is what the Russian embassy has said. Prime Minister Keir Starmer's January 16 solidarity visit to Ukraine was a desperate attempt by the British handlers to keep the agonizing Kiev regime afloat. The content of statements and official documents testifies to the new, highly provocative British plans with regard to that country, including the establishment of military bases on its territory and assistance in the development of long-range weapons. This is fraught with the risk of another round of escalation. Discussions are continuing about the deployment in Ukraine in one form or another of a contingent from Britain as part of a certain all-Western core of occupation with unclear goals and tasks. And in fact, Starmer, whilst he was in Kiev, openly spoke about the deployment of a British military contingent to Ukraine as part of a peacekeeping force after a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine has been reached. I've already said that the Russians have ruled out the idea of such a force, and frankly, reading this agreement that Starmer has come away with, they're going to say to themselves that no way can we have the British in Ukraine. They're clearly a hostile country. If they come to Ukraine as a peacekeeping force, they will stay. They will remain here. They will establish bases there. They will act as if Ukraine is a launch point for potential aggressions against our country, including the Sea of Azov, which we currently control and which, according to our constitution, is now ours. And the British embassy went on to say that the British establishment, which did not allow Kiev to end the conflict in the spring of 2022, remains true to itself and continues to push that country into the abyss. And this is absolutely correct. Ukraine could have walked away with a peace agreement in Istanbul. It was already signed. It was already initialed, I should say. It was there in draft, but the main outlines of the agreement had been reached, and as has been discussed and essentially confirmed by all parties now, along came Boris Johnson. He telephoned Zelensky, told him not to sign the agreement, told Zelensky that Britain and the United States would not give Ukraine security guarantees if he did sign the agreement. And he went to Kiev, and alongside his American friends in the Biden administration, he promised the Ukrainians that if they walked away from the agreement and kept fighting indefinitely, the Americans and the British would give them all the weapons they needed in order to win. And we see where that has brought Ukraine to the brink of the abyss. And as the Russians are saying, this document, what it's calculated to do is to push the Ukrainians finally into that abyss. I am at a loss for words to express my feelings about this document. The only conclusion I can reach, because clearly this wasn't just cobbled together by Starmer himself, is that the purpose of the Zelensky-Starmer agreement is not to chart some sort of course for Ukraine. It is to keep the war going, to obstruct the negotiations that Trump is trying to get going, to make it as difficult for Trump to come to an agreement with the Russians as possible, and to keep Ukraine fighting in a war which it is about to lose. Now, if this is nihilism disguised as statecraft, or elevated to statecraft, as I recently described the policies of the Biden administration, then I simply don't know what is. It ignores all the advice from all the various military people, Douglas McGregor, David Davis, people like that, who say that the war in Ukraine is lost, and the sooner this fact is acknowledged, the better. It ignores the fact on the ground. It also ignores the advice that senior people in the British military are giving. Now, I watched an interview by the former chief of the British military, Lord Duran, one of the more capable and level-headed officers in the British military, just saying. Anyway, he pointed out that the state of the British military at this current point in time is very poor. The British Army is down to 78,000 men, which is just about the smallest it has been in modern British history. I believe you have to go back to the Victorian era to find a time when the British military in Britain was of this sort of size. Of course, in Victoria's day, Britain was at the heart of an empire, and it could call on far greater military forces. It had the Indian Army, which it commanded and controlled, at its disposal, and that, for example, was huge. But we don't have that today. We're reduced in Britain to our own resources, and these apparently now number 78,000 men. And Lord Duran said that, if you're going to send a viable peacekeeping force to Ukraine, and he was only talking about a peacekeeping force, he said this would have to number around 5,000 to 10,000 men. And he said the resources to do that currently are simply not there. The military is already massively overstretched. How can it go on and carry out an operation of this kind? We see that once again, the British are in effect making commitments and promises to the Ukrainians, leading the Ukrainians further and further down the path, the primrose road, to their own destruction, as Professor Mearsheimer put it. They're doing it, making promises that they're never going to be able to fulfill. Now, one day, when the history of this war is written, I think that there is going to be a very, very stern view, a very, very critical view taken by historians of British policy throughout this war. The way it has consistently goaded Ukraine to do the most extreme and reckless things. The way it has tried to trap the United States into open-ended commitments in the war in Ukraine. The way it has obstructed all efforts to achieve peace, be that the Minsk agreement before the war, or be it the Istanbul agreement, and the way it's now trying to put a spoke in the negotiations between the Russians and the Americans, which will shortly get underway. Well, as I said, all of this is astonishing. And I have to say that ultimately it can do no good to Britain whatsoever. And it's perhaps unsurprising that the British people have been kept largely in the dark about all of this, because I can't imagine that if they did know about it, they would ever approve of it. Well, that's this bizarre agreement. As I said, I called it yesterday a piece of paper. That is what it is. In a couple of months' time, in a couple of years' time, it will be largely forgotten. But it sets out in black and white the folly and delusions of grandeur of a British political class that has lost all contact with reality, and which is, to say it straightforwardly, leading Britain into a very bad place. Now, as I discussed also in my programme yesterday we also had another treaty of an entirely different kind. And this is the treaty that the Russians and the Iranians have concluded with each other. And this is a completely different document. It is, on the contrary, a very practical document setting out very detailed lines of cooperation between these two countries. Now, in my program yesterday and in other programs, I said that if the Russians were going to provide assistance to Iran to develop its air defense system and other military systems, they would at the very least seek absolutely concrete assurances from the Iranians that Iran would not proceed with a nuclear weapons program. Russia, or to be precise, the Soviet Union, is one of the original signatories in 1968 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Russians have consistently adhered to the terms of that treaty. They have repeatedly made known their strong opposition to Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. They were instrumental in negotiating and agreeing the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran in 2015, which was intended to place barriers in the way of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. And I don't think that has changed in any shape or form. Well, I did get some comeback from another number of people about this. I was told that the agreement would not actually act as any kind of barrier to Iran, though the people who contacted me, or at least one of them, went out of their way to say that as far as this person was aware, the Iranians had no actual plans to develop nuclear weapons. But anyway, the point was that the Russians would never, in fact, make any kind of agreement or commitment to Iran conditional on that kind of action taken by Iran. I doubted that this was the case, and in fact, now that I've seen the agreement, I see that the agreement itself indirectly prohibits Iran from proceeding with nuclear weapons development. And the provision is contained in Article 10 of the agreement. The contracting parties, which is to say Russia and Iran, shall closely cooperate on issues of arms control, disarmament, non-proliferation, and ensuring international security within the framework of relevant international treaties and international organizations to which they are parties, and shall conduct regular consultations on these issues. The key words here are, of course, non-proliferation. That clearly refers to nuclear weapons. And ensuring international security within the framework of relevant international treaties. The treaties in question must unquestionably include, first and foremost, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968, to which, of course, both the Soviet Union and Iran are signatories, and international organizations to which they are partners also refers implicitly to the International Atomic Energy Agency. Now, this, in other words, is an actual treaty. It's not yet been ratified by the parliaments of the two countries, but presumably at some point in the next few weeks it will be. This is an international treaty, a binding legal document in which Iran formally commits itself not to acquire nuclear weapons. Now, of course, it's already made that commitment in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, so you could say that, legally speaking, this treaty does not add anything to that. But, of course, if Article 10 of this treaty is violated by Iran proceeding to develop nuclear weapons, then I am confident that the Russians will say that the treaty has failed and that it has now become some sort of a nullity. It would be a clear violation of that treaty. So anyway, what else does the treaty say? Well, to a degree that actually surprises me, it is on all fours with the information that I had been provided about it before. Now, the treaty is very, very careful to make clear that it is not an alliance, that it is not established an alliance between the two countries. But actually, it only just stops short from doing that. The relevant provision is Article 3, subparagraph 3. In the event that one of the contracting parties is subjected to aggression, the other contracting party shall not provide any military or other assistance to the aggressor that would facilitate the continuation of aggression, and shall assist in ensuring the differences that arise are settled on the basis of the Charter of the United Nations and other applicable norms of international law. So, this form of words needs to be again read carefully. It does not say that Russia and Iran are allies. It does not say that Russia would be under any obligation to come to Iran's assistance if Iran were attacked by, say, Israel. But actually, it does come very close to saying that were that to happen, Iran could look to Russia at least for help, because the article speaks about Russia assisting in ensuring that the differences that arise are settled on the basis of the Charter of the United Nations. In other words, that the Russians would undertake diplomatic steps to try to persuade the Israelis to stop their attack on Iran. I'm talking about a hypothetical scenario, of course. But then it goes on to say, and other applicable norms of international law could assist Iran using other applicable norms of international law. Now that can include and does allow for the provision of military assistance. Military assistance to Iran to defend Iran against aggression. So it's not quite as simple as I think some people say. And Article 5 then discusses how the militaries of the two countries will cooperate with each other. But in some ways, even more important is Article 6. Within the framework of a comprehensive long-term and strategic partnership, the contracting parties confirmed their commitment to the development of military technical cooperation on the basis of relevant agreements between them, taking into account mutual interests and their international obligations, and consider such cooperation as an important component of maintaining regional and global security. Military technical cooperation on the basis of relevant agreements between them. So this tells us, this is Article 6, paragraph 1, that there are going to be agreements, relevant agreements between Iran and Russia about how to move forward with military technical cooperation. These agreements will almost certainly be secret agreements. They will not be published. And we're told that this military technical cooperation will be developed in accordance with these secret agreements. And I am absolutely certain that this covers what I have heard, which is that Russia is indeed going to take steps to build up Iran's defenses. It will supply Iran with advanced air defenses. Quite plausibly, it will integrate Iran's air defense system into its own air defense system, ensuring that Iran is protected from potential air attack by, again, say Israel, air or missile attack by, say, Israel. So this is actually a rather stronger agreement and a more straightforward agreement in its provisions than, if I have to be honest, I personally expected. I suspect that the Iranians insisted on some of these clauses. The Russians probably insisted on Article 10, and the Iranians in return insisted on Article 6. We see that Iran is committing not to proceed with development of nuclear weapons, and Russia in return is committing to providing Iran with military technical assistance, which is to say with an air defense system and probably with other assistance to develop and secure its various arms military position. So as I said, this is actually quite a strong document. It falls short of being a treaty of alliance, but it actually comes quite close to that. Now, in other respects, the treaty is very much as one might have expected. There's lots of discussions about economic links, about development of Iran's civilian nuclear program. And here it's now clear that the Russians are not going to build an entirely new nuclear power station in Iran. The commitment rather is to enlarging the already existing nuclear power station that the Russians have already largely built for Iran at Bushehr. There's going to be 2 new big facilities at Bushehr, and it looks as if Bushehr is going to be expanded substantially. And, well, there's going to be cross-border links, there's going to be rail and pipeline links and road links, there's going to be work on tourism, on integrating financial systems, on developing agriculture together, that sort of thing, which one might have expected. Now, I should say that though Russia and Iran are in a sense neighbours, they're both Caspian Sea states. They both have shorelines on the Caspian Sea. And of course, the Soviet Union and Iran absolutely were neighbours. Because relations between Iran and the Soviet Union were very bad for most of the Cold War, there are actually minimal road, railway, air and pipeline links between them. It will probably take a substantial amount of time, decades probably, before transport connections, transport corridors between Iran and Russia are fully developed, because they will have to be developed from scratch. And this has been a major factor in preventing the development of Russian-Iranian trade. And one of the things that this treaty talks about is Iran and Russia working together to ensure the stability of Central Asia, the Central Asian republics, which of course are long-standing partners of Russia and which used to be formerly part of the Soviet Union, but which most importantly, these railroad, pipeline and air links will have to cross if they're ever going to be established. So one can understand why Central Asia is becoming even more important to the Russians and the Iranians, as it already is in relations between the Russians and the Chinese. And in the meantime, the treaty confirms that Iran has now been granted observer status in the Eurasian Economic Union. This is the group of former Soviet republics, including countries like Kazakhstan and Belarus, as well as Russia, which have increasingly been integrating their economic processes. And I remember years ago when he was president of Iran, the former Iranian president, Ahmadinejad, actually even floating the possibility that Iran might one day join this association, which was at that point still very much in its formative stages. And, well, I'm not going to say that that's going to happen tomorrow or perhaps ever, but a step has been taken with this treaty which might eventually lead to that. And of course, all of this is happening within the framework of the BRICS. The treaty doesn't actually mention the BRICS, but it does mention the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, of which, of course, both Iran and Russia are part. Since I've been talking about the BRICS, I might just further add that today the Brazilian presidency of the BRICS has just announced that another country, Nigeria, has been granted partner status to the BRICS. It's not become a full member of the BRICS like Indonesia was a week ago, but it has been granted partner membership and clearly intends eventually to join the BRICS. By the way, on the question of Indonesian membership, as I think I pointed out in a previous program, it turns out that the decision to include Indonesia as a member of the BRICS was made at the summit, the BRICS summit in Johannesburg, all the way back in 2023. So anyway, BRICS continues to expand, and we have now 3 strategic partnerships, very carefully developed and formulated strategic partnerships at its core. The single most important one, which is the one between China and Russia, which is very highly developed, which is underpinned by a huge number of treaties and agreements, many of which, of course, are secret, and which brings together what are the 2, in some ways, most developed economies in the BRICS. Then there's a second partnership agreement, which is the one between Russia and India, which is going to be further consolidated by a trip to India that Putin is expected to make in the first half of this year. And now we have a third agreement, which is the one between Russia and Iran. We can see how all of these various web of agreements and treaties that the Russians and the Iranians and the Chinese and the Indians are weaving around each other are indeed tying all of the various elements together. Now, for the Iranians, if this can work, and of course, as I've said, there's an awful lot that needs to be done. Building up an air defense system in Iran is going to take a very long time. A couple of years at least for it to get to a full level of proficiency. Building the transportation, the rail and road corridors and the pipelines and all of that is going to take still more years. Developing the shipping lanes, building up the harbors on the Persian Gulf. As I said, we're talking about a work of decades. But over that period of time, just as North Korea has basically escaped, broken out of the siege that the United States and the other Western powers had imposed on it as a result of the position that North Korea has taken over the Ukraine war. So it seems to me that Iran is on the brink of doing the same. President Trump and his officials may be looking at a policy of maximum pressure on Iran. But it's perhaps as well to say that with every month that passes, as relations between Russia and Iran deepen, as economic links between these countries grow, it will be more difficult to maintain that policy of maximum pressure. And beyond a certain point, it will become redundant. Iran and Russia are going to form, according to this agreement, a free trade zone. And that will be a free trade zone which will also link Iran to China and potentially to India as well. So Iran could be on the brink of breaking out of isolation. Now, to those who worry, who are concerned about this, let me reiterate again that Article 10 of this treaty makes it quite clear that Iran has had to make concrete assurances to the Russians that it is not going to press forward with a nuclear weapons program. It is there in black and white. Article 10 of the treaty speaks for itself. If the tension between the Western powers and Iran is indeed linked to Iran's nuclear program, and many of us have doubts about that, then this treaty should actually form a point of reassurance Whether, of course, it will do so is a completely different matter. Now, I'm going to round off this program by briefly speaking about the fact that the War Cabinet in Israel has indeed, as I rather expected that it would, signed off, ratified the ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. That doesn't mean that the deal will remain, the ceasefire will remain in force for very long. Quite possibly, it will start to break down. There's a complicated process of 42 days through which various steps need to be taken. And it may be that we won't get through that process or through those 42 days. But I have to say that given the exhaustion on both sides, I think that there is a possibility that this will stick, at least for a while. The only question, the big question for me about this agreement at this moment in time is what is going to happen inside Israeli politics. Apparently Smotrich and Ben Gvir voted in the cabinet against ratification of this ceasefire agreement. Will they indeed leave the government? What will that mean for Israeli politics? And what will that do to the general direction of Israeli policy in the Middle East? Israel is apparently now already in a situation where it's had to conduct airstrikes of some kind against HTS in Syria. I would have thought that Israel has altogether too many battles on its hands, and as I said, it is suffering from growing problems internally. I would have thought that Smotrich and Ben Gvir potentially leaving the government should be, at least in the short term, a stabilizing factor. But whether they will leave and what the effect of that will be, I don't know. And anyway, to be quite clear about this, we are still very, very far from any general peace in the Middle East. Anyway, this is where I finish my program today. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Don't forget also to check your subscription to this channel and to tick the like button if you've liked this video. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.